There are some cases from my years beside Sherlock Holmes that remain vivid in my memory, not because of violence or excitement, but because they revealed something unexpected about the man himself. For a long time, I believed Holmes to be almost detached from ordinary human life. He rarely spoke of his childhood, his family, or any personal matter. He seemed to exist entirely in the present, devoted to observation, deduction, and the endless puzzles that drifted into our rooms at Baker Street. On a warm summer evening, however, that impression changed. The day had been calm, the city outside lay beneath a golden haze, and after tea we sat together in our familiar sitting room. Our conversation wandered lazily from one subject to another, touching on science, history, and the curious ways in which talent can pass from one generation to the next. As we discussed heredity, I remarked that Holmes's remarkable powers surely came from years of training and discipline. He listened quietly, giving an answer that surprised me. According to Holmes, there was another man who possessed those same gifts in even greater measure, not famous detective, not celebrated scholar, but his own brother. The revelation caught me entirely off guard. During all our years together, I had never once heard Holmes mention a brother, yet now, with unusual ease, he began to speak of him. His name, Holmes told me, was Mycroft Holmes, and in certain matters of pure reasoning, Mycroft surpassed even Sherlock himself. I remember staring at my friend in astonishment as the evening shadows lengthened across Baker Street, unaware that this simple conversation was about to lead us into one of the strangest mysteries we would ever encounter. As Holmes continued his account, I found myself increasingly intrigued. It was not merely the existence of a brother that surprised me. What astonished me even more was Holmes' calm insistence that this brother possessed powers of observation greater than his own. Over the years, I had watched Sherlock Holmes unravel mysteries that baffled police inspectors, government officials, and learned men alike. To imagine someone exceeding those abilities seemed almost impossible. Naturally, I questioned him further. Mycroft, he explained, was 7 years older. Why Sherlock devoted his talents to detective work, his brother lived a far quieter existence. There was no hunger for adventure in Mycroft Holmes, no desire to chase criminals through London's foggy streets, no interest in gathering evidence or confronting danger. Yet when presented with a problem, he could often arrive at the correct solution with astonishing speed. Holmes described him as a man who preferred the comfort of an armchair to any physical exertion. If Sherlock was a hunter tracking his prey across the countryside, then Mycroft was a scholar who could identify the animal merely by examining a single footprint. The difference lay not in intelligence, but in energy. According to Holmes, Mycroft possessed immense reasoning powers, but lacked the ambition to put them into action. This curious description fascinated me, where I wondered, could such a remarkable man be found? Holmes smiled faintly and checked his watch. His brother, he informed me, could almost certainly be located at a place called a Diogenes Club. The name meant nothing to me. Apparently noticing my confusion, Holmes rose from his chair and suggested an evening walk. The weather was pleasant. The sun was slowly sinking behind London's rooftops, and there was still time before darkness settled over the city. If I cared to accompany him, he said, I could meet both the strangest club in London and one of the strangest men who belonged to it. Within minutes, we had left Baker Street behind, were making our way through the bustling evening streets, unaware that our casual stroll was leading directly toward a mystery that would soon place lives in grave danger. The evening was one of those rare London evenings that seemed almost peaceful. A gentle warmth lingered in the air as Holmes and I walked westward through the crowded streets. Carriages rolled past at a steady pace, their wheels rattling softly over the stones, while the glow of gas lamps slowly began to replace a fading daylight. As we walked, Holmes continued speaking of his brother. It puzzled me greatly that a man of such extraordinary ability could remain virtually unknown. If Mycroft truly possessed reasoning powers superior to Sherlock's, why was his name not spoken throughout London? Why did Scotland Yard not seek his advice? Why did newspapers not celebrate his achievements? Holmes appeared amused by my questions. According to him, Mycroft had no interest whatsoever in fame. He occupied respectable government position, spending his days examining figures and reports. His routine rarely changed. Each morning he walked from his lodgings to Whitehall. Each evening he returned by the same route. Beyond that, he sought little excitement. Indeed, Holmes suggested that his brother might be one of the least adventurous men in England. The true center of Mycroft's social life, if it could be called social at all, was the Diogenes Club. At this point, Holmes began describing the institution itself. It sounded so peculiar that I initially suspected he was joking. London, he explained, contained many men who preferred solitude to company. Some were shy, others disliked conversation. A few simply wished to be left alone with their thoughts. The Diogenes Club was specifically for such people. There, members could sit for hours reading newspapers, studying journals, or simply contemplating life in complete silence. Conversation was discouraged. In most rooms, it was forbidden altogether. A member who repeatedly disturbed the peace by speaking too freely risked expulsion. The very idea seemed astonishing to me. A club dedicated to avoiding human interaction. Yet Holmes described it with perfect seriousness. As he spoke, we reached the broad and elegant streets of Pall Mall. The buildings stood grand and dignified in the evening light, their stone facades glowing softly beneath the lamps. Holmes slowed his pace and pointed toward an imposing doorway set among the distinguished clubs of the district. There was nothing remarkable about the entrance itself. No sign announced its unusual purpose. No crowd gathered outside. Yet behind those quiet walls sat Mycroft Holmes, the one man whom Sherlock Holmes openly acknowledged as his superior in observation and deduction. And within only a few minutes, I would meet him for the very first time. Holmes paused before the entrance and gave me a brief warning. Once inside, he said, it would be wise to speak as little as possible. The advice seemed unusual, but I soon understood the reason. We entered a quiet hall and passed through a set of glass doors. Beyond them stretched a large and richly furnished room. Comfortable chairs stood in neat rows beneath shaded lamps. Newspapers and journals lay upon tables. Gentle clouds of tobacco smoke drifted lazily through the still air. Yet what struck me most was the silence. Dozens of men occupied the room. Some read newspapers, others studied books. Few simply sat motionless, lost in thought. Not one of them spoke. No conversations drifted across the room. No laughter disturbed the calm atmosphere. The silence so complete that even the turning of a newspaper page seemed unusually loud. Holmes led me through this remarkable scene and into a smaller chamber overlooking Pall Mall. There he left me for several minutes. I waited beside the window, observing the evening traffic below and wondering what manner of man Mycroft Holmes might prove to be. At length, the door opened. Sherlock returned, accompanied by another gentleman. At first glance, The family resemblance was unmistakable. The newcomer possessed the same sharp features and penetrating eyes that distinguished his younger brother. Yet there, the similarities largely ended. Mycroft Holmes was considerably larger in build. His frame was broad and heavy, giving him an appearance of great solidity. His face was fuller than Sherlock's, but intelligence shone from it just as clearly. His eyes immediately caught my attention. They were pale gray and unusually thoughtful, carrying a distant look, as though his mind were constantly occupied with matters invisible to everyone else. He greeted me warmly and spoke with effortless courtesy. I was surprised by the friendliness of his manner. Somehow I had expected a colder figure. As we settled near the window, the two brothers exchanged a few remarks regarding an earlier case. To my astonishment, Mycroft seemed already familiar with the details and calmly identified the culprit before Sherlock confirmed that he was correct. Neither brother appeared surprised. It was spoken of almost casually, as though such feats occurred every day. Watching them together felt strangely fascinating. For the first time, I could see where some of Sherlock's remarkable gifts had originated. The same quick intelligence, the same habit of careful observation, the same ability to draw conclusions from the smallest details. Yet there was also a difference. Sherlock possessed restless energy, always eager to pursue a mystery, wherever it led. Mycroft seemed perfectly content to let the mysteries come to him. As I sat between the two brothers in that silent club, I had the curious sensation of witnessing two different expressions of the same extraordinary mind. And before many minutes had passed, Mycroft would provide a demonstration of those remarkable powers that I would never forget. We had scarcely settled ourselves beside the window when Mycroft Holmes directed our attention toward the street below. The evening traffic flowed steadily along Pall Mall. Gentlemen walked beneath the glow of the lamps, clerks hurried homeward after their day's work, and an occasional carriage rolled past the club entrance. Among the pedestrians, two men approached together. One was immediately recognizable as a billiard marker. Traces of chalk upon his waistcoat and cuffs revealed his occupation even from a distance. The other man appeared less remarkable. He was short and dark, carrying several parcels beneath one arm. His clothes were neat but unexceptional, and there seemed nothing particularly distinctive about him. Yet both Holmes brothers watched him with great interest. Sherlock spoke first. The man, he declared, was clearly a former soldier. Mycroft agreed at once, and added that the soldier had only recently left military service. The deductions continued. India had been his station. He had served as a non-commissioned officer. His branch was artillery. He was a widower, and he had children. I confess that by this point I could contain my skepticism no longer. The conclusions appeared impossible. The man was simply walking along the pavement, carrying packages. How such a waif of information could be extracted from a brief glance seemed utterly beyond belief. The brothers, however, calmly explained their reasoning. His upright bearing, sun-darkened complexion, and air of authority suggested military service abroad. Certain details of his clothing indicated a recent return to civilian life. The way he carried himself pointed toward a senior enlisted rank rather than an ordinary private. His morning attire suggested the recent death of someone close to him. The parcels offered further clues. Among them was an object resembling a baby's rattle. Another appeared to be a children's picture book. The conclusion was obvious to them. There were children waiting at home, and since the man was purchasing these items himself, while dressed in mourning, it was likely that his wife was no longer alive. The explanation was delivered so calmly and naturally that it seemed almost effortless. I watched the stranger disappear into the crowd and felt once again that peculiar sensation I often experienced in Sherlock's company, the realization that others were observing a different world from the one visible to ordinary eyes. Mycroft leaned back comfortably and brushed a few grains of snuff from his coat. The small demonstration appeared to have amused him, yet his attention soon shifted elsewhere. There was, he remarked, another matter that might prove far more interesting. A curious problem had recently come to him. Though he lacked the energy to investigate it personally, the circumstances were highly unusual. As he spoke, he drew a notebook from his pocket and scribbled a brief message. A waiter carried it away. Mycroft explained that he had summoned a gentleman who could tell the story far better than he could. The man's name was Mr. Mellis. He was a Greek interpreter, and his strange experience, Mycroft assured us, marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary mysteries either Holmes' brother had encountered. A few minutes after the note had been sent, the gentleman arrived. He was a short, broad-shouldered man, with dark hair and an olive complexion, features that immediately suggested his Mediterranean ancestry. Yet his English was refined and polished, carrying hardly a trace of a foreign accent. As he entered the room, I noticed certain nervous energy about him. He seemed eager to speak and relieved to find listeners willing to hear his account. This was Mr. Mellis. By profession, he served as an interpreter in London. Wealthy travelers, foreign visitors, lawyers, businessmen, and government officials frequently relied upon his linguistic skills. Though he spoke many languages, his Greek heritage made him especially sought after whenever matters involving Greece arose. Sherlock Holmes welcomed him warmly and invited him to tell his story from the beginning. Mr. Mellis settled himself into a chair and gathered his thoughts. The events, he explained, had occurred only 2 nights earlier. On that particular Monday evening, he had been at home when an unexpected visitor arrived. Such interruptions were not uncommon in his line of work. Foreigners often required assistance at odd hours, and interpreters were accustomed to being summoned without warning. The visitor introduced himself as Mr. Harold Latimer. According to Mellis, he was a handsome young Englishman, fashionably dressed, and possessing an air of confidence that bordered upon arrogance. Latimer claimed that a Greek gentleman urgently needed an interpreter. The matter, he said, involved private business that could not wait until morning. Would Mr. Mellis accompany him at once? Nothing about the request seemed unusual. Mellis agreed. A carriage was already waiting outside, and the young Englishman appeared anxious to depart quickly. Before long they were seated inside and moving through the evening streets of London. At first the journey seemed entirely ordinary. The carriage rolled through familiar districts, passing illuminated shop windows and busy thoroughfares. Mellis expected they were traveling toward Kensington, which was the destination Latimer had mentioned. Then something happened, something so strange that even as he recounted it to us, the memory appeared to trouble him deeply. Without warning, Harold Latimer reached into his pocket and withdrew a heavy club, weighted with lead. He examined it casually, almost thoughtfully. Then he placed it beside him on the seat. No explanation was offered. No threat was spoken. Yet the message was perfectly clear. Mr. Mellis suddenly found himself alone in a carriage with a powerful stranger carrying a dangerous weapon. The atmosphere changed instantly. The pleasant evening journey had become something altogether different. As we listened in the silent room of the Diogenes Club, I saw that even now the memory caused Mr. Mellis discomfort, and worse was still to come, for within moments he would discover that he was no longer a willing passenger, but a prisoner being carried into the unknown. Mr. Mellis told us that after Harold Latimer placed the heavy club beside him, the journey took on a far more sinister character. The young Englishman calmly reached toward the carriage windows and pulled them shut. At first, this seemed a minor action, but Mellis quickly noticed something alarming. The glass had been covered. Sheets of paper completely blocked the view outside. No matter where they traveled, he would be unable to recognize a street, a building, or even a landmark. The realization sent a chill through him. His destination was being deliberately concealed. Latimer spoke quietly, almost politely, but his words carried an unmistakable threat. He explained that it would be inconvenient. Mellis discovered where they were going. Therefore, precautions had become necessary. Mellis protested. He pointed out that such conduct was illegal and outrageous. The response was calm. Latimer admitted that the situation might seem unusual, but he made it clear that resistance would accomplish nothing. No one knew where Mellis was. No one knew with whom he traveled. For the time being, he was entirely within their power. After that, silence settled over the carriage. Outside, London disappeared. The interpreter could no longer see the streets, the houses, or the lamps. He was sealed inside a moving box, carried through darkness toward an unknown destination. Time passed slowly, very slowly. He listened carefully, hoping to gather clues. Sometimes the wheels rattled loudly over rough paving stones. At other moments, they glided smoothly across quieter roads. Yet these sounds provided little certainty. The route twisted and turned so frequently that any attempt to estimate their location soon became hopeless. Minute after minute passed, then an hour, then another. The journey seemed endless. Mr. Mellis kept glancing at his watch, trying to preserve some sense of control over the situation. He knew roughly when they had departed, and he carefully noted each passing minute. The isolation weighed heavily upon him. No view, no conversation, only the steady movement of the carriage and the knowledge that he was being transported somewhere against his will. At last, after nearly 2 hours, the vehicle began to slow. The wheels rolled over what sounded like a different surface. There was a slight turn, a brief pause, and finally, the carriage came to a complete stop. For the first time since leaving London, a window was lowered. Through the opening, Mellis caught only the briefest glimpse of his surroundings. A low archway, a single lamp burning above it. Nothing more. The door opened immediately. Before he could gather any further impressions, he was hurried from the carriage and guided inside. He remembered only a vague sense of trees and open ground surrounding the entrance. Whether it was a country estate, a suburban villa, or a house hidden within private gardens, he could not tell. The door closed behind him. The long journey was over. But as he stood in the dimly lighted hall of that mysterious house, Mr. Mellis felt certain of one thing. Whatever awaited him beyond those walls would be far stranger and far more dangerous than anything he had yet experienced. Inside the house, Mr. Mellis found himself standing in a large entrance hall, illuminated by a single gas lamp, turned low. The dim light barely reached the corners of the room. Shadows clung to the walls and gathered beneath the staircase, making it difficult to judge either the size or appearance of the place. Even so, he noticed enough to suggest wealth. Paintings hung upon the walls. The furnishings appeared expensive. Everything hinted that the house belonged to someone of considerable means. Yet, despite these signs of comfort, there was something deeply unsettling about the atmosphere, the silence, the darkness, the feeling of secrecy. As Mellis looked around, another man emerged from the shadows. He was entirely different from Harold Latimer. Where Latimer was young, strong, and handsome, this newcomer was small, thin, and rather shabby in appearance. His shoulders were rounded, spectacles rested upon his nose. His face was pale and unhealthy, and there was an odd nervousness in every movement he made. Yet Mellis immediately felt more alarmed by this man than by the younger one. The stranger's manner possessed a peculiar quality that was difficult to describe. He smiled frequently, he laughed softly, but there was nothing pleasant in either expression. His laughter came in short, jerky bursts that sounded strangely unnatural, as though amusement had become twisted into something cruel. The man greeted Mellis warmly enough and thanked him for coming. At the same time, however, he made it clear that cooperation would be expected. Failure to cooperate, he suggested, could have serious consequences. The threat was wrapped in polite language, yet it was unmistakable. Mellis asked why he had been brought there. The answer was simple. A Greek gentleman was staying in the house. This gentleman spoke no English. Certain questions needed to be asked. Certain answers needed to be translated. That was all. At least, that was what they claimed. The nervous man led him deeper into the building. A door opened. Beyond it lay a large room furnished with obvious luxury. The carpet was thick beneath his feet. Velvet chairs stood arranged around the room. A marble fireplace gleamed faintly in the dim light. Decorative objects occupied the corners. One piece, which appeared to be a suit of Japanese armor, caught his attention before disappearing once more into shadow. Only a single lamp illuminated the chamber. Even that lamp had been deliberately turned down. It seemed almost as though the occupants wished to conceal themselves. A chair had been placed beneath the light. Mellis was instructed to sit there and wait. The younger man disappeared briefly. The older man remained nearby, watching him. Several moments passed. Then another door opened. Footsteps approached slowly. A figure entered the room, and as the stranger moved into the circle of pale yellow light, Mr. Mellis felt a sudden shock of horror. For the man before him looked less like a guest than a prisoner, less like a living person than a man who had already suffered beyond endurance. The man who entered the room presented a truly disturbing sight. Even years later, while recalling Mr. Mellis's account, I can still imagine the image that confronted him beneath that dim lamp. The stranger was extremely thin. His cheeks were hollow. His skin possessed the unhealthy pallor of someone who had been deprived of sunlight for a very long time. Yet despite his weakness, there remained a stubborn strength in his expression. His eyes shone with fierce determination, revealing a spirit that had not been broken. What struck Mellis most, however, was the condition of the man's face. Several strips of sticking plaster had been placed across it in a grotesque pattern. Most alarming of all, a large piece covered his mouth. The purpose was obvious. The prisoner had been prevented from speaking. He moved forward slowly and collapsed rather than sat into a chair opposite the interpreter. The older Englishman immediately produced a slate and pencil. The arrangement became clear. Since the prisoner's mouth was sealed, questions would be translated into Greek and answers would be written upon the slate. The process began at once. The first question concerned certain papers. Would the prisoner sign them? The answer appeared swiftly. No. Another question followed. Would he sign under any circumstances? Again the man wrote his reply. Only specific conditions were met. His captors were visibly dissatisfied. More questions followed. Again and again they returned to the same subject: the documents, the signature, the prisoner's refusal. Each answer carried the same stubborn resistance. Though physically weakened, he remained completely unyielding. As Mr. Mellis translated the exchanges, an idea slowly formed in his mind. Neither Harold Latimer nor the older man understood Greek. That fact created an opportunity, a dangerous one, but perhaps the only opportunity available. At first he tested the situation cautiously. While translating their questions, he added few harmless words of his own. Nothing happened. The captors showed no sign of suspicion. Encouraged, he became bolder. With each new question, he quietly inserted additional inquiries, intended to uncover the prisoner's identity. The answers came back in writing, piece by piece, carefully, secretly. The prisoner revealed that he had been held for 3 weeks. He stated that his captors were starving him. He insisted that he would never surrender to them. Every response revealed remarkable courage. The more Melis learned, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary dispute. Serious crime was unfolding before his eyes. A helpless man was being imprisoned, threatened, and systematically tortured for some unknown purpose. Yet the most important information was still hidden. Who was he? Where had he come from? Why had he been brought to England? Melis continued his dangerous questioning, hoping to uncover the truth before his captors noticed. And at last, as the prisoner wrote another answer upon the slate, the first truly significant clue emerged. A name, a Greek name, one that would soon become central to the entire mystery. The prisoner identified himself as Paul Crates, and the story was only beginning. As the strange interrogation continued, Mr. Melis carefully concealed his growing excitement. At great personal risk, he had already learned several important facts. The prisoner was named Paul Crates. He came from Athens. He had been held captive for weeks and was being deliberately starved. Most importantly, he remained absolutely determined not to submit to his captors. The interpreter continued his secret inquiries whenever an opportunity presented itself. The answers came slowly, hidden among the official questions that the 2 Englishmen insisted upon asking. Why would he not sign? Why was he resisting so stubbornly? What gave him the strength to endure such treatment? The replies suggested that another person was someone he cared about deeply. Someone whose fate mattered more to him than his own suffering. Again and again, he refused to cooperate unless certain conditions were met. The mystery deepened. The older Englishman became increasingly agitated as the interview progressed. His nervous laughter sounded sharper now, less controlled. Even Harold Latimer seemed frustrated by the prisoner's unwavering resistance. Still, the man refused. The slate moved back and forth. Questions, answers, threats, defiance. The scene possessed a strange, dreamlike quality. The dim room, the half-light faces, the silent prisoner forced to communicate through writing, while his captors watched over him. Melis later admitted that he felt as though he had stepped into some dark theatrical performance whose meaning remained hidden from him. Yet, he sensed that events were approaching a crisis. The tension in the room continued to grow. Then, quite suddenly, everything changed. A door opened. A woman entered. At first, she appeared only as a graceful figure emerging from the shadows. The light was poor, but Melis could make out dark hair and a flowing white dress. There was elegance in her bearing and beauty in her movements, even in that dimly illuminated chamber. She spoke a few words in English. Her tone suggested loneliness and concern. Apparently, she had grown tired of remaining elsewhere in the house and had come searching for company. Then she saw the prisoner. For a single instant she froze. The room seemed to stop breathing. The woman stared. The prisoner stared back, and suddenly recognition flashed between them. A cry escaped her lips, not in English, in Greek, one name, Paul. At the same moment, the prisoner's self-control shattered. With a desperate effort, he tore the plaster from his mouth. His first free word in weeks echoed through the room. "Sophie!" Brother and sister rushed toward one another. For one brief moment, they embraced. It was enough. Enough to reveal the truth that the captors had worked so hard to conceal. Enough to expose their secret. Enough to convince Mr. Mellis that he was witnessing not merely a crime, but a tragedy involving an entire family. The reunion lasted only seconds. Then chaos erupted throughout the room. The moment of recognition lasted only a heartbeat. No sooner had Sophie Cratyids reached her brother than the two Englishmen sprang into action. Harold Latimer seized the young woman and dragged her away from Paul. The sudden violence transformed the room from a place of tense negotiation into one of open desperation. Paul struggled, despite his weakened condition. Weeks of imprisonment and starvation reduced his strength, yet the sight of his sister had awakened fierce determination within him. For the first time, Mr. Mellis witnessed the full force of the prisoner's spirit. The older man, however, moved with surprising speed. Together, the conspirators overpowered their victim. Sophie was forced from the room through one door, while Paul was dragged through another. Their cries echoed briefly through the house. Then silence returned, an unnatural silence. Mellis suddenly found himself alone. For a few precious seconds, no one remained in the chamber except himself. The opportunity was brief. Instinctively, he rose from his chair. Perhaps he could reach a window. Perhaps he could discover where he had been taken. Perhaps he could find some clue that might later help the authorities. His mind raced through possibilities. Yet, before he could take more than a step, a movement near the doorway stopped him cold. The older Englishman had returned. He stood perfectly still, watching. The expression on his face carried none of the nervous friendliness he had displayed earlier. The mask slipped. Behind it lurked something cold and dangerous. Mr. Mellis slowly resumed his seat. The man entered the room and spoke in a calm voice, as though nothing unusual had occurred. He explained that a misunderstanding had taken place. Certain family matters, he suggested, often produced emotional scenes. There was no cause for concern. The explanation convinced no one, least of all Mr. Mellis. By now the interpreter had assembled enough pieces of the puzzle to understand the broad outline of what was happening. The young woman and the prisoner were clearly related. The captors were attempting to force Paul Cratyids into signing documents. Those documents almost certainly involved money or property. And whatever rights Paul possessed, he was determined not to surrender them. The older man reached into his pocket and produced several gold coins. Payment, compensation for the evening's services. The gesture felt grotesque, as though money could erase what had taken place, as though witnessing cruelty transformed into a legitimate business transaction. Yet the most disturbing moment came afterward. The man stepped closer. His pale eyes fixed themselves upon Mellis. In a quiet voice, almost conversational, he delivered a warning. If a single word of this affair reached another person, consequences would follow. Not perhaps, not possibly, certainly. The threat was spoken softly. That made it all the more terrifying. Mellis understood that he was dealing with men who would not hesitate to carry out such promises. And as he prepared to leave the mysterious house, one troubling thought occupied his mind above all others. If these men were capable of imprisoning Paul Cratyids, what might they do now that their secret had been discovered by Sophie herself? The moment of recognition lasted only a heartbeat. No sooner had Sophie Cratyids reached her brother than the two Englishmen sprang into action. Harold Latimer, seized the young woman and dragged her away from Paul. The sudden violence transformed the room from a place of tense negotiation into one of open desperation. Paul struggled, despite his weakened condition. Weeks of imprisonment and starvation had reduced his strength, yet the sight of his sister had awakened a fierce determination within him. For the first time, Mr. Mellis witnessed the full force of the prisoner's spirit. The older man, however, moved with surprising speed. Together, the conspirators overpowered their victim. Sophie was forced from the room through one door, while Paul was dragged through another. Their cries echoed briefly through the house, then silence returned. An unnatural silence. Mellis suddenly found himself alone. For a few precious seconds, no one remained in the chamber except himself. The opportunity was brief. Instinctively, he rose from his chair. Perhaps he could reach a window. Perhaps he could discover where he had been taken. Perhaps he could find some clue that might later help the authorities. His mind raced through possibilities. Yet, before he could take more than a step, a movement near the doorway stopped him cold. The older Englishman had returned. He stood perfectly still, watching. The expression on his face carried none of the nervous friendliness he had displayed earlier. The mask had slipped. Behind it lurked something cold and dangerous. Mr. Mellis slowly resumed his seat. The man entered the room and spoke in a calm voice, as though nothing unusual had occurred. He explained that a misunderstanding had taken place. Certain family matters, he suggested, often produced emotional scenes. There was no cause for concern. The explanation convinced no one, least of all Mr. Mellis. By now, the interpreter had assembled enough pieces of the puzzle to understand the broad outline of what was happening. The young woman and the prisoner were clearly related. The captors were attempting to force Paul Crates into signing documents. Those documents almost certainly involved money or property. And whatever rights Paul possessed, he was determined not to surrender them. The older man reached into his pocket and produced several gold coins. Payment, compensation for the evening's services. The gesture felt grotesque, as though money could erase what had taken place, as though witnessing cruelty transformed into a legitimate business transaction. Yet the most disturbing moment came afterward. The man stepped closer. His pale eyes fixed themselves upon Mellis. In a quiet voice, almost conversational, he delivered a warning. If a single word of this affair reached another person, consequences would follow. Not perhaps, not possibly, certainly. The threat was spoken softly. That made it all the more terrifying. For Mr. Mellis understood that he was dealing with men who would not hesitate to carry out such promises. And as he prepared to leave the mysterious house, one troubling thought occupied his mind above all others. If these men were capable of imprisoning Paul Crates, what might they do now that their secret had been discovered by Sophie herself? As Mr. Mellis concluded this portion of his remarkable narrative, the room at the Diogenes Club fell silent. For several moments, none of us spoke. The strange sequence of events lingered heavily in the air. The mysterious journey, the hidden house, the imprisoned Greek, and the brief but heartbreaking reunion between brother and sister. Sherlock Holmes sat motionless, the fingertips pressed together. Whenever his mind worked at its highest speed, he often appeared strangely calm. I had learned to recognize that expression. Behind those quiet eyes, countless possibilities were already being examined and discarded. Mycroft Holmes seemed equally thoughtful. The mystery had clearly captured his attention, no small accomplishment, considering his usual indifference toward practical investigations. Mellis, meanwhile, appeared relieved simply to have shared his burden. For 2 days, He had carried the memory alone. Now, others knew. Others could help. At length, Sherlock leaned forward. Several important facts, he observed, appeared almost certain. Paul Cratides had traveled from Greece to England voluntarily. No evidence suggested that he had been abducted from his homeland. Instead, he had come seeking his sister. That meant Sophie had likely arrived in England first. Perhaps she had been visiting friends. Perhaps she had settled temporarily in London. Whatever the circumstances, she had fallen under the influence of Harold Latimer. The consequences had been disastrous. Sherlock reasoned that Paul's resistance almost certainly involved property or inheritance rights. The documents repeatedly mentioned by the captors pointed strongly in that direction. Some legal obstacle prevented them from gaining control of whatever they sought. Paul's signature would remove that obstacle. Therefore, they imprisoned him, starved him, threatened him. And still he refused. The facts fit together with uncomfortable precision. Yet several questions remained unanswered. Where was the house? Who exactly was the nervous older man? And most urgently of all, what would happen next? The danger had increased dramatically. Before Sophie entered the room, the captors possessed a secret. Afterward, the secret had been exposed. Brother and sister now knew that each was being held within the same house. The conspirators could no longer maintain the deception. Sherlock pointed out the obvious consequence. Desperate criminals often became more dangerous when their plans began to collapse. The realization darkened the mood around the table. For the first time, the mystery felt truly urgent. This was no longer merely an intellectual puzzle. Two innocent people were trapped. One had already endured weeks of suffering. The other appeared equally powerless. And somewhere, hidden beyond London's reach, the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed might place them in greater peril. As I watched Sherlock Holmes rise from his chair and begin pacing slowly across the room, I sensed that the case had already taken hold of him completely. The hunt had begun. And before the night was over, events would move far faster than any of us expected. After Mr. Mellis finished speaking, Mycroft Holmes revealed that he had not remained entirely idle. Although practical investigation was not his preferred occupation, he had already taken a small but important step. Earlier that day, he had placed advertisements in several newspapers. The notices were simple. Rewards would be offered for information concerning a Greek gentleman named Paul Cratides and a Greek lady named Sophie. It was a modest effort, yet perhaps someone somewhere might recognize the names. Sherlock approved of the idea. Any clue, however small, could prove valuable. The discussion continued as the evening deepened outside the club windows. London was now wrapped in darkness, the gas lamps glowing like scattered stars along the streets below. Holmes began examining the facts aloud. The hidden house remained the greatest challenge. Mr. Mellis had traveled for nearly 2 hours, yet the journey itself revealed little. The windows had been covered, the route deliberately confused, and every precaution taken to conceal the location. Still, Holmes believed the house could eventually be found. Criminals often imagined themselves cleverer than they truly were. Some small mistake would reveal them. It always did. More immediate was the question of Sophie Cratides. Unlike her brother, she might be traceable. She had lived openly in England before her disappearance. Friends, acquaintances, landlords, servants, someone would remember her. If her history could be uncovered, the entire mystery might begin to unravel. As Holmes reasoned through the problem, I watched Mr. Mellis carefully. The interpreter looked exhausted. His ordeal had clearly shaken him. Yet he remained determined to help. The fate of Paul Cratides weighed heavily upon his conscience. After all, he had looked directly into the eyes of a suffering man and promised nothing. He had left him behind in that hidden house, still surrounded by enemies. No sensitive person could forget such a thing. Eventually, our meeting came to an end. Mr. Mellis departed. Mycroft returned to his quiet routines. Sherlock and I left the Diogenes Club together and stepped once more into the London night. The streets were quieter now. Most businesses had closed. Only the occasional carriage disturbed the stillness. As we walked home, Holmes remained unusually thoughtful. Several times he stopped to send telegrams from public offices along our route. Messages flew outward into the night, carrying inquiries to various contacts who might assist the investigation. Each telegram represented another thread cast into the darkness. Some would return empty. One might return with the answer. I asked whether he truly believed the case could be solved. Holmes smiled faintly. In his view, the essential outline was already visible. The challenge lay only in proving it, yet even he admitted there was one danger: time. If the conspirators sensed that others were closing in upon them, they might act rashly. And desperate men, when cornered, often left tragedy behind them. As we approached Baker Street, neither of us realized that the case was about to take a dramatic turn. For someone was already waiting inside our rooms, someone whose unexpected arrival would transform suspicion into urgent action. Sherlock Holmes and I returned to Baker Street sometime after our meeting at the Diogenes Club. Throughout our walk home, Holmes had remained deep in thought. The mystery of Paul and Sophie Cratyies had clearly seized his imagination, and I knew from experience that his mind would continue turning over every detail long after midnight. When we reached our rooms, however, an unexpected sight awaited us. Someone was already there, seated comfortably in an armchair. A cigar resting between his fingers was Mycroft Holmes. The appearance of Sherlock's brother astonished both of us. Mycroft was not a man known for sudden activity. Indeed, he often seemed to regard unnecessary movement as one of life's great inconveniences. For him to leave the Diogenes Club, cross London, and arrive before us at Baker Street suggested that something important had occurred. Sherlock immediately sensed the same thing. There could only be one explanation. News had arrived. And the news, judging by Mycroft's expression, was significant. Mycroft calmly explained that shortly after our departure, a reply had come in response to one of his newspaper advertisements. At once, the atmosphere in the room changed. Sherlock sat down opposite his brother. I moved closer. For the first time that evening, we possessed something more substantial than theories and deductions. We possessed a lead. Mycroft produced a letter. The writer claimed to know the young Greek woman named Sophie Cratyies. Not only that, but he stated that he could provide details regarding her history and present circumstances. Most importantly, he supplied an address. According to the letter, Sophie was connected with a house called the Myrtles, situated in Beckenham. The name meant little to me. To Sherlock Holmes, however, it meant opportunity. At last there was a place, a direction, a destination toward which the investigation could move. The possibility immediately presented itself. At the Myrtles might even be the mysterious house described by Mr. Mellis. If so, Paul Cratyies could still be imprisoned there at that very moment. Every minute mattered. Sherlock rose to his feet almost instantly. His decision was made. Rather than visit the letter writer first, he argued that the greater priority lay with the prisoner. Stories could wait, rescues could not. If Paul Cratyies truly remained captive, delay might prove disastrous. The urgency of the situation spread to all of us. The mystery was no longer unfolding at a distance. For the first time, there seemed a genuine chance of locating the hidden house and confronting those responsible. Yet, even as plans were being formed, a darker possibility entered my thoughts. What if the criminals had already realized that their secret was exposed? What if they knew that someone had spoken? And what if at that very moment, they were already taking steps to disappear forever? Those questions lingered heavily in the room as we prepared for the next stage of the investigation. For the hunt was about to leave the realm of deduction and enter the realm of action. Once Sherlock Holmes had decided upon a course of action, events began moving rapidly. There was no thought of waiting until morning. If Paul Curtides was indeed being held prisoner, every passing hour increased the danger. Holmes intended to act immediately. Plans were quickly arranged. A visit would first be made to Scotland Yard in order to secure official assistance. Entering a private house without proper authority could create complications, and Holmes preferred to avoid unnecessary obstacles whenever possible. Before leaving, however, another thought occurred to us. The Greek interpreter might prove invaluable if Paul Curtides were found. Communication had already been difficult once. There was every chance his services would again be required. Therefore, we altered our route slightly and made our way to the interpreter's lodgings. The streets were growing quieter as we traveled. Most Londoners had settled into their evening routines, unaware that somewhere nearby a desperate race against time was unfolded. When we arrived at Melis's residence, we expected to find him at home. Instead, we received disturbing news. The interpreter was gone. A visitor had called for him not long before. Without delay, Melis had departed in a carriage. The landlady knew little else. Sherlock questioned her carefully. What sort of visitor had arrived? The description came quickly. A small gentleman, thin-faced, wearing spectacles, and apparently laughing while he spoke. The moment those details were given, Holmes's expression hardened. The description matched perfectly. It could only be the nervous older conspirator from Mr. Melis's story, the same man with the twitching features and unsettling laugh, the same man who had threatened him only 2 nights before. The realization struck all of us at once. Mr. Melis had been found. The criminals knew he had spoken, and now he had vanished into their hands for a second time. The implications were terrifying. The conspirators were no fools. They had undoubtedly seen the newspaper advertisements. They would immediately suspect that the interpreter had betrayed their secret. Men willing to imprison and starve another human being were unlikely to show mercy towards someone they considered a traitor. The situation had become far more urgent. No longer were Paul and Sophie Curtides alone in danger. Mr. Melis himself now required rescue. Without another word, Holmes hurried us onward toward Scotland Yard. The mystery was accelerating. Every clue pointed toward a final confrontation. And somewhere in the darkness beyond London, 3 captives, and perhaps several murderers, waited for fate to catch up with them. Our visit to Scotland Yard consumed more time than Sherlock Holmes would have liked. Official procedures, necessary though they were, rarely moved at the speed he preferred. While Holmes possessed little patience for bureaucracy, he understood its importance. If a private residence was to be searched, legal authority would strengthen our position and prevent complications later. At last, arrangements were completed. Inspector Gregson agreed to accompany us. Though not the most brilliant officer Holmes had encountered, Gregson was experienced, practical, and willing to act when circumstances demanded it. Together we made our way toward the railway station. The night had grown darker. A cool breeze swept through the streets as London slowly settled into sleep. Yet for us, there would be no rest. Every minute increased our anxiety. Mr. Mellis had disappeared. Paul Cratides remained imprisoned somewhere. Sophie Cratides was almost certainly trapped alongside them. And the criminals now knew that their secret was in danger of exposure. The train journey passed quickly. None of us felt inclined toward conversation. Holmes sat silently, staring into the darkness beyond the window. I recognized the look. His mind was working relentlessly, examining possibilities and anticipating outcomes. The greatest concern was obvious. Would we arrive too late? When men realize that discovery is approaching, they often flee. Some abandon their plans. Others attempt to erase evidence. The most dangerous seek revenge before they disappear. It was impossible to know which course these conspirators might choose. At length, we reached Beckenham. The station stood quiet beneath the night sky, and only a handful of passengers remained upon the platform. From there we hired a conveyance and proceeded toward the address supplied in Mycroft's letter. The journey was short. Soon we found ourselves approaching a large property set back from the road. Tall trees bordered the grounds. Dark shadows covered the lawn. The house itself loomed ahead, silent and motionless. This was the Myrtles. For a moment, none of us spoke. We simply gazed toward the building. The windows were dark. No lamps burned. No movement could be seen. The entire place possessed an abandoned appearance. Inspector Gregson suggested that the occupants might already be asleep. Holmes was unconvinced. Something about the silence troubled him. Then he noticed a detail that escaped the rest of us. Marks upon the drive, wheat tracks, fresh ones. By examining them briefly, Holmes reached a conclusion. A heavily loaded carriage had left the property not long before our arrival. A great deal of it. The weight could be read in the depth of the tracks. The criminals, it seemed, had anticipated danger. They had packed, and perhaps they had already fled. The possibility chilled us all. If Holmes was correct, then we might have traveled all this way, only to find an empty house and vanished enemies. Yet one question remained. If the conspirators had escaped, what had become of their prisoners? The discovery of the fresh wheel tracks deepened our unease. Sherlock Holmes crouched briefly beside them, studying the impressions in the soft earth illuminated by the gate lamp. To him, the signs were unmistakable. A carriage had departed recently, not an empty carriage. A heavily loaded one. The deeper grooves told their own story. Luggage, a hurried departure, possibly an escape. Inspector Gregson remained skeptical at first, but even he could not deny that the tracks appeared fresh. The evidence suggested that whoever had occupied the Myrtles had left only a short time before our arrival. The question was whether anyone remained behind. We advanced cautiously up the drive. The house loomed before us, dark against the night sky. Not a single window showed light. No servant answered our approach. No sound emerged from within. The silence seemed unnatural. A place abandoned too quickly often possesses a peculiar atmosphere, as though the building itself remembers the haste with which its occupants departed. That was the feeling I experienced as we approached the entrance. Inspector Gregson rang the bell. The metallic sound echoed faintly through the house. No response. He knocked loudly. Still nothing. Again he knocked. Again silence. The darkness remained complete. For several moments we stood waiting. The wind stirred softly through the surrounding trees, producing a faint rustling among the branches. Beyond that, there was no movement at all. It seemed increasingly likely that Holmes had been correct. The birds had flown. The The nest was empty, yet something prevented us from turning away. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was the memory of Paul Cortelli sitting beneath that dim lamp, still alive when Mr. Mellis had last seen him. Holmes refused to leave. He paced slowly along the front of the house, examining windows, walls, and entrances. His determination was unmistakable. If even the slightest chance remained that someone inside required help, he intended to find it. At length he disappeared around the side of the building, leaving the rest of us waiting near the door. The minutes felt unusually long. The silent house watched us from the darkness. Every shadow seemed to conceal possibilities. At last, Holmes returned. There was a faint spark of satisfaction in his expression. He had found what he was seeking. One of the windows had not been secured properly. A way inside existed. And with that discovery, our uncertainty ended. The mystery that had begun in the quiet rooms of the Diogenes Club was about to carry us directly into the heart of danger. For beyond those darkened walls, unknown to us, life and death still hung in the balance. Despite the ominous silence surrounding the myrtles, Sherlock Holmes refused to abandon hope. If the house had truly been deserted, then perhaps the criminals had fled in haste. And when people flee in haste, they often leave something behind, a clue, a witness, or, if fortune favored us, their prisoners. Inspector Gregson pounded upon the front door. The sound echoed through the still night. No answer came. Again he knocked. Again, silence. No servant appeared. No light flickered behind the curtains. The entire building seemed lifeless. Yet Holmes was not satisfied. Leaving us briefly, he disappeared into the darkness that surrounded the house. A few minutes later, he returned with a look of quiet determination. He had found a window. One of the catches had not been secured properly. The discovery provided our entrance. Gregson hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Under the circumstances, with lives potentially at risk, there was little alternative. One by one, we climbed inside. The room into which we entered was immediately familiar from Mr. Mellis's description. Even before Holmes confirmed it, I recognized certain details: the luxurious furnishings, the heavy carpet, the arrangement of the furniture, the dim atmosphere. This was the very chamber where the Greek interpreter had been questioned. For a moment we stood surveying the room. The criminals were gone. Of that there seemed little doubt. Yet signs of recent occupation remained everywhere. On a nearby table sat an empty bottle of brandy. Several glasses stood beside it. Fragments of a meal remained untouched. The scene suggested a hurried departure, a gathering interrupted, a plan abandoned before completion. Then Holmes suddenly raised a hand. "Listen," he whispered. We obeyed. At first, I heard nothing. Then faintly, from somewhere above us, a sound drifted through the darkness, a low moan, weak, distant, but unmistakably human. Every man in the room heard it. The sound rose briefly, faded, and returned again. Someone was alive inside the house. Someone was suffering. Without hesitation, Holmes rushed into the hall. The rest of us followed. The mournful noise continued, guiding us upward. Flight after flight of stairs disappeared behind us. As we climbed toward the source, my heart pounded with anticipation. Had we found Paul Cratides? Mr. Mellis? Perhaps both. The sound led us to the upper floor. 3 doors faced us. From behind the central door came the terrible moaning. It was weaker now, more desperate. Like the final cries of someone slooping beyond help. The door was locked, yet fortune favored us once again. The key remained in the lock. Holmes seized it. For one brief second, we exchanged glances. Then he turned the key, and threw the door open. What awaited us beyond that threshold will become one of the most chilling scenes I witnessed during all my year beside Sherlock Holmes. The door flew open. Sherlock Holmes rushed forward at once, yet scarcely had he crossed the threshold when he stopped abruptly and staggered backward into the corridor. One hand rose instinctively to his throat. His face tightened. For a moment, I feared he had been attacked. Then the explanation became painfully clear. A foul vapor poured from the room. The air itself seemed poisoned. Charcoal, Holmes gasped. Stand back. The smell struck us almost immediately. Heavy, suffocating, deadly. Years of medical practice had taught me the danger of such fumes. In an enclosed space, they could silently rob a victim of consciousness and life itself. The room beyond was filled with them. No ordinary lamp illuminated the chamber. Instead, a small metal brazier stood near the center of the floor. Within it glowed a dull blue flame. The charcoal had been left burning deliberately. The windows were shut. The door had been locked. Anyone trapped inside would slowly suffocate. It was murder, nothing less. Holmes acted instantly. Racing through the poisonous air, he reached a window and threw it open. Cool night air rushed inward. Then he seized the brazier itself and hurled it outside into the darkness. Fresh air flooded the room. Even so, several moments passed before it was safe to enter. At last we stepped cautiously across the threshold. The scene that greeted us remains vivid in my memory. Two figures lay against the wall, bound hand and foot, motionless. The first was immediately recognizable. Despite the swollen features and pale complexion, I knew him at once. It was Mr. Mellis, the unfortunate interpreter. A dark bruise marked one side of his face where he had evidently been struck. His wrists and ankles were tightly secured. He looked deathly still. Beside him lay another man, taller, even thinner, his body reduced almost to a skeleton by prolonged suffering. Several strips of sticking plaster still clung to his face. The sight left no room for doubt. This was Paul Cratides, the prisoner we had crossed London to save. For a terrible moment, I feared that both men were already dead. I dropped to my knees beside them and began my examination. The room remained thick with poisonous fumes, and every second mattered. Paul showed no sign of life. His face had taken on the dreadful appearance that physicians know too well. The struggle was over. His suffering had ended. But Mr. Mellis, there was still hope, very faint hope, yet hope nonetheless. And so, while Holmes searched the room and Gregson hurried to assist, I devoted every effort to pulling the interpreter back from the edge of death. Outside, the night wind stirred the trees of the myrtles. Inside, the final chapter of the mystery was beginning to reveal itself. For several anxious minutes, all attention centered upon Mr. Mellis. The poor interpreter lay unconscious in the hallway where we had carried him, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The charcoal fumes had nearly accomplished their terrible purpose. As a physician, I had encountered many desperate situations, but there was something particularly sinister about this one. No violence, no bloodshed, simply a locked room and poisoned air, a death arranged quietly and efficiently. Working as quickly as possible, I loosened his clothing and administered what remedies were available. Fresh air was brought in from outside. Brandy was obtained from the dining room below. Every effort focused upon stimulating his fading strength. At last, after what seemed a very long time, there came a small sign of improvement, a faint movement, then another. His eyelids fluttered. A weak breath escaped his lips. Relief swept through us. Mr. Mellis, was alive. The same could not be said for Paul Cratides. I had examined him carefully. The unfortunate Greek had endured starvation, imprisonment, repeated threats, and finally attempted murder. His weakened body had simply been unable to survive the poisoning. He had died before our arrival. The realization cast a shadow over the entire house. For all our efforts, we had come too late to save the man whose courage had impressed us from the very beginning. Sherlock Holmes stood silently beside the body for several moments. He rarely displayed emotion openly, yet I could see that the outcome displeased him deeply. Paul Cratides had fought bravely. He had refused to surrender, and in the end, his resistance had cost him his life. Meanwhile, Inspector Gregson and the others began searching the premises. Room after room was examined. Cupboards, drawers, bedrooms, servants' quarters, every corner of the house. Yet the criminals themselves were nowhere to be found. Harold Latimer had vanished. His sinister associate had vanished. And Sophie Cratides was gone as well. Only traces of their presence remained. Signs of hurried packing, discarded objects. Evidence that the house had been abandoned in great haste. The picture was becoming clearer. Once the conspirators realized that discovery was inevitable, they had prepared to flee. Before leaving, however, they had attempted to eliminate the two men who could identify them, Paul and Mr. Maylis. One victim had perished. The other had survived by the narrowest of margins. As the hours passed and the search continued, Mr. Maylis gradually recovered enough strength to speak. And when he finally recounted what had happened after his abduction, the last missing pieces of the mystery began to fall into place. As Mr. Maylis slowly regained consciousness, the grim atmosphere inside the Myrtles remained unchanged. The house felt strangely hollow now. Its occupants had vanished. Its secrets had been exposed. Yet the echoes of recent suffering seemed to linger within every room. Wrapped in blankets and supported by a chair, the interpreter gradually recovered enough strength to speak. His voice was weak, and several times he paused to gather breath before continuing. The account he gave confirmed many of Sherlock Holmes' suspicions. Earlier that evening, the same nervous Englishman, the one with the twitching features and unsettling laughter, had arrived unexpectedly at his lodgings. The moment Mr. Maylis saw him, fear had returned. The man carried no visible weapon at first. He scarcely needed one. His reputation alone was enough. Within moments, however, the threat became unmistakable. Resistance would be useless. Maylis was forced into a carriage once again and carried away into the darkness. This second journey ended at the Myrtles. The conspirators had brought him back for one final purpose. They still hoped to break Paul Cratides. One last interview, one last attempt, one last demand for a signature. According to Maylis, the atmosphere inside the house had been even more desperate than before. Time was clearly running out. The criminals were frightened. Something had changed. Whether they had learned of the newspaper advertisements or merely sensed danger approaching, they knew their situation was becoming precarious. As a result, their threats grew harsher. The negotiations became more aggressive, yet Paul remained exactly as he had always been, unyielding. No promise tempted him, no threat frightened him, no cruelty persuaded him. Even after weeks of imprisonment, starvation, and isolation, he refused to surrender the rights they sought. Maylis remembered the prisoner's extraordinary courage with genuine admiration. The man's body had weakened. His spirit had not. At last the conspirators accepted defeat. The interview ended. Paul was returned to confinement. Then their attention shifted toward the interpreter himself. The advertisements had revealed the truth. Someone had spoken. Someone had betrayed their secret. In their eyes, that person was Mr. Mellis. The consequences followed swiftly. He was accused, threatened, and finally struck with a heavy blow that rendered him unconscious. Everything after that disappeared into darkness. His next memory was of waking to find Sherlock Holmes, Inspector Gregson, and myself standing over him. The rest he could only guess, yet the evidence surrounding us filled in the missing details. The criminals had intended it, and neither he nor Paul Crates would survive the night. The charcoal brazier, the locked room, the sealed windows, it had all been carefully arranged. Had we arrived an hour later, perhaps even less, both men would certainly have perished. As Mr. Mellis finished speaking, Holmes gazed thoughtfully into the darkness beyond the open window. The case was nearly solved, yet one crucial question remained unanswered. Where were Harold Latimer, Wilson Kemp, and Sophie Crates now, and would justice ever catch up with them? The hours that followed were spent gathering together the final fragments of the mystery. Inspector Gregson and his officers continued their search of the Myrtles, examining every room and every object that might reveal where the fugitives had gone. Yet the house yielded surprisingly little. The conspirators had prepared their escape carefully. Whatever documents they considered valuable had been removed. Personal belongings had disappeared. Even the servants who might have provided useful testimony were nowhere to be found. Only scattered traces remained to tell the story of the drama that had unfolded there. As dawn approached, Sherlock Holmes reconstructed the events with characteristic clarity. The sequence now seemed almost certain. Sophie Crates had come to England some months earlier, probably as a guest among friends or acquaintances. During her stay, she encountered Harold Latimer. Latimer possessed charm, confidence, and a handsome appearance, qualities that often conceal darker intentions. At some point, he gained influence over the young woman. Whether through affection, deception, or manipulation, he succeeded in drawing her away from those who cared for her. News of the situation eventually reached Athens. There, Sophie's brother Paul learned what had happened. Concerned for his sister's welfare, he traveled to England. Had he understood the true danger awaiting him, he might have acted more cautiously. Instead, he seems to have approached the matter openly and honestly. That honesty became his downfall. Soon after arriving, he fell into the hands of Latimer and his associate, Wilson Kemp. The two men quickly discovered something important. Paul controlled, or at least protected, access to property and wealth that they desperately wanted. Without his cooperation, their plans could not succeed. Therefore, they imprisoned him. Weeks passed. Threats failed. Starvation failed. Lacillation failed. Again and again, they attempted to break his will. Again and again, they failed. What impressed Holmes most was the prisoner's extraordinary resilience. Many stronger men would have surrendered long before. Paul Crates never did. Even as his health deteriorated, he continued resisting. His determination became the central obstacle to the conspirators' ambitions. That determination ultimately cost him his life. As the morning light slowly filtered through the windows of the Myrtles, I found myself reflecting upon the tragedy. Paul had crossed an entire continent to protect his sister. Instead, he had found captivity, cruelty, and death. Yet perhaps there was a small comfort. In his final days, he had at least learned that Sophie was alive. He had seen her, spoken her name, held her briefly in his arms. A fleeting reunion, certainly, but one that must have meant everything to him. And somewhere beyond England's borders, 3 people remained missing, 2 criminals. and one young woman whose future remained uncertain. Although much of the mystery had been unraveled, several important questions still lingered. The greatest concerned Sophocrates. Unlike her brother, she had vanished without a trace. No one knew whether she had accompanied the fugitives willingly or under compulsion. Sherlock Holmes believed the answer lay somewhere between the two. From everything we had learned, Sophie herself appeared to have been deceived. She had likely trusted Harold Latimer at first. Whatever charm had attracted her had probably concealed his true nature for some time. Only later, when events had progressed too far to escape easily, did she begin to understand the trap into which she had fallen. The scene witnessed by Mr. Mellis seemed to support this theory. Her reaction upon seeing Paul had been entirely genuine. There had been no hesitation, no uncertainty, only shock, recognition, and distress. The discovery that her brother had been secretly imprisoned under the same roof had clearly come as a terrible revelation. That single moment explained much. It suggested that the conspirators had carefully separated the siblings. Paul had been hidden from her. Sophie had been hidden from Paul. Each had been kept ignorant of the other's presence. Only chance had exposed the deception. Holmes often remarked that the most elaborate schemes are frequently destroyed by the smallest accidents. So it appeared here. One unexpected meeting, one glimpse across a room, one cry of recognition, and weeks of careful planning collapsed. The more I reflected upon the matter, the more remarkable it seemed. Had Sophie not entered that room at precisely that moment, the truth might never have emerged. Mr. Mellis would have remained ignorant of the family connection. The conspirators would have continued their deception. Paul's fate might have remained forever unknown. Instead, everything changed in an instant. As daylight spread across the grounds of the Myrtles, Holmes continued piecing together the final details. Wilson Kemp, he believed, was likely the true strategist behind the affair. Harold Latimer possessed confidence and boldness, but Kemp possessed something far more dangerous: patience, calculation, cruelty. The older man's nervous manner concealed a ruthless intelligence. Indeed, Holmes considered him the more formidable of the pair. Together they formed a dangerous combination. One supplied charm, the other supplied cunning. For a time the partnership had served them well. Yet now their plans lay in ruins. A dead prisoner remained behind. A surviving witness could identify them. The authorities were searching. Every newspaper might soon carry their descriptions. Their future had become uncertain. And as the first rays of morning touched the empty house, Sherlock Holmes turned his attention toward the final stage of the investigation, the pursuit of those who had escaped into the wider world. The days following our discovery at the Myrtles were occupied by a wide-ranging search. Descriptions of Harold Latimer and Wilson Kemp were circulated among police departments. Railway stations received notices. Ports were watched. Telegraph messages crossed the country, carrying inquiries and warnings. Yet the fugitives remained elusive. Sherlock Holmes was not particularly surprised. Men who had planned their crimes with such care would naturally prepare an escape as well. Still, he refused to believe that they could vanish forever. Every criminal, no matter how clever, leaves traces behind. The difficulty lies only in finding them. As information gradually accumulated, we learned more about Wilson Kemp. His past proved every bit as unpleasant as Holmes had suspected. He possessed a long history of dishonesty, questionable associations, and schemes that hovered dangerously close to outright criminality. Though he had avoided major convictions, his reputation among those who knew him was deeply unfavorable. In many respects, He seemed perfectly suited to the role he had played in the affair. Harold Latimer remained more mysterious. Unlike Kemp, he possessed the appearance of a respectable gentleman. One could easily imagine how an intelligent and trusting young woman might place confidence in him. Indeed, Holmes remarked that society often fears obvious villains while overlooking those who hide behind good manners and attractive appearances. The observation struck me as painfully accurate. Meanwhile, efforts continued to uncover the exact legal matter that had led to Paul Cratyides' imprisonment. Though certain details remained unclear, the general picture emerged steadily. The property of the Cratyides family represented considerable wealth. Control of that wealth depended upon legal formalities that the conspirators could not easily bypass. Paul's signature was essential. Without it, their ambitions remained blocked. This explained everything: the captivity, the starvation, the repeated demands, the desperate attempts to force compliance. The mystery, once so confusing, now appeared almost tragically simple. Greed had driven the entire affair. Greed had destroyed lives. Greed had transformed deception into kidnapping, and kidnapping into murder. One evening, while discussing the case in Baker Street, I asked Holmes whether he believed the criminals would eventually be captured. He considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps not." The world was large, and Europe offered many places in which a determined fugitive could disappear. Yet Holmes doubted that the story had ended. Men like Latimer and Kemp rarely retired peacefully. Their own characters often became their downfall. The same recklessness and selfishness that led them into crime frequently led them into disaster afterward. At the time, those words seemed merely thoughtful speculation. Only months later would we discover how remarkably accurate they were. For far beyond England, in the distant European city, events were already moving toward a conclusion neither criminal could possibly have foreseen. In the weeks following the events at the Myrtles, information continued to emerge in scattered fragments. None of it was dramatic. No great breakthrough occurred. No sudden arrest brought the affair to an immediate conclusion. Instead, the truth revealed itself gradually, piece by piece, like a landscape becoming visible through lifting fog. Through inquiries made in England and abroad, a clearer picture of Sophie Cratyides' circumstances began to appear. Before meeting Harold Latimer, she had been regarded as a respectable and well-connected young woman. Friends who knew her described her as intelligent, independent, and possessed of considerable personal charm. Nothing in her earlier life suggested that she would willingly become entangled in criminal schemes. This fact strengthened Sherlock Holmes's belief that deception had played a central role from the beginning. Latimer had almost certainly presented himself as something he was not: a gentleman, a trustworthy companion, perhaps even a devoted admirer. The disguise had evidently been convincing. Such transformations are not uncommon among confidence tricksters. Indeed, Holmes often remarked that successful swindlers rely less upon intelligence than upon their ability to understand human hopes and weaknesses. People tend to believe what they wish to believe. Latimer had likely exploited that tendency. The consequences were devastating. By the time Sophie's friends recognized the danger, matters had progressed beyond their control. Concerned and alarmed, they informed her brother in Athens. That decision ultimately brought Paul Cratyides to England. Looking back, one cannot help wondering whether anyone involved understood the risks awaiting him. The answer is probably not. Had Paul known the character of the men he confronted, he might have sought legal assistance or police protection immediately upon arrival. Instead, He appears to have acted openly and directly. Honorable men often assume others possess similar standards. Criminals frequently take advantage of that assumption. Thus Paul walked into a trap. His honesty became a weapon used against him. As Holmes reviewed these developments, he observed that many tragedies begin with evil intentions, but with misplaced trust, a single mistaken judgment, a single deceptive acquaintance, a single decision made in good faith. The Greek interpreter, Fair, contained all three, and while the details were becoming clearer, the whereabouts of the fugitives remained unknown. Somewhere beyond England, Harold Latimer, Wilson Kemp, and Sophie Curtides continued their uncertain journey. The hunt was far from over. As the official investigation widened, reports began arriving from various ports and railway terminals. Most proved useless. The descriptions of Latimer and Kemp were circulated widely, but Europe is a large place, and determined fugitives can travel great distances in a short time. Nevertheless, Sherlock Holmes followed every lead with interest. Even when a clue proved false, it sometimes revealed something useful about the direction in which the criminals might be moving. The pattern that gradually emerged suggested haste. The conspirators had not left England with the calm confidence of successful men. They had fled. Their departure from the Myrtles had been rushed. Their possessions packed hurriedly. Their plans altered at the last possible moment. Everything pointed toward panic. This observation pleased Holmes. Fear, he often said, is one of the greatest enemies of the criminal mind. A frightened criminal makes mistakes. 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 A frightened criminal makes Most importantly, a frightened criminal begins to distrust everyone, including his own associates. The relationship between Harold Latimer and Wilson Kemp interested Holmes greatly. On the surface, they appeared united by common interests, yet partnerships built upon greed rarely remain stable. Each man knows the character of the other. Each understands that loyalty has limits. And when danger approaches, suspicion grows quickly. Holmes suspected that the pressure of flight would test their alliance severely. Where once they had worked together, they might soon begin blaming one another. Where once they had shared ambitions, it might soon compete for survival. Such tensions frequently end badly. Meanwhile, the memory of Myrtles remained vivid in my mind, particularly the upper room, the locked door, the poisoned air, the narrow margin separating life from death. Whenever I thought of Melis, I marveled at how close he had come to sharing Paul Cratides' fate. An hour later, perhaps even 30 minutes later, and our rescue would have failed entirely. The realization reinforced a lesson I had learned many times beside Sherlock Holmes. Timing matters. The difference between success and tragedy is often measured not in days, but in minutes. For Paul Cratides, those minutes had run out. For Mr. Melis, they had not. And somewhere beyond England's shores, the men responsible continued to flee from the consequences of their actions. But Holmes remained convinced that consequences were coming. Whether through the police, through chance, or through forces of their own making, he believed that Latimer and Kemp had not escaped their fate, they had merely postponed it. Several months passed. The case of the Greek interpreter gradually slipped into the background of our lives, joining the growing collection of mysteries that had occupied Sherlock Holmes during those busy years in Baker Street. Yet it was never entirely forgotten. Some stories end neatly. A criminal is arrested, a victim is rescued, justice is served. This case offered no such satisfaction. Paul Cretides was dead. His sister had vanished, and the two men responsible had escaped beyond our reach. From time to time I would notice Holmes gazing thoughtfully into the fire whenever the subject arose. Though he rarely admitted it, unsolved matters troubled him, not because they wounded his pride, but because they offended his sense of order. A puzzle left incomplete remained an irritation to his remarkable mind. Even so, there was little more to be done. The official investigation continued, but no reliable sightings emerged. Reports arrived from various corners of Europe only to dissolve upon examination. False leads, mistaken identities, rumors, nothing substantial. Meanwhile, life in London moved onward. New clients appeared at Baker Street. Fresh mysteries demanded attention. The city itself seemed determined to bury the affair beneath the endless tide of daily events. Yet somewhere beyond England, principal actors in the drama remained alive. Harold Latimer, Wilson Kemp, and Sophie Crotty. Of the three, Sophie occupied my thoughts most often. I wonder what fate had befallen her. After the flight from the Myrtles, had she escaped her captors? Had she remained with them under coercion? Or had she discovered some means of obtaining freedom? The truth was impossible to know. Holmes maintained a more practical view. He believed that Sophie represented both the greatest threat and the greatest danger to the fugitives. She knew too much. She had seen her brother. She understood the deception. She could not identify the men responsible. For criminals who depended upon secrecy, such knowledge was perilous. Therefore, Holmes remained convinced that the relationship between the three could not continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, conflict would arise, and when it did, consequences would follow. Looking back now, I believe that Holmes had already glimpsed the shape of the ending long before any evidence appeared. He understood human nature, greed, fear, resentment. These forces rarely remain dormant forever. They grow, they fester, and eventually they erupt. Of us, the months passed. The trail grew colder. The mystery seemed destined to remain incomplete. Then, without warning, a newspaper clipping arrived from abroad, a small article, easy to overlook, yet within those few printed lines lay the final chapter of the entire affair. And when Holmes finished reading it, I saw at once that the case of the Greek interpreter was not quite over after all. The newspaper clipping arrived on an otherwise ordinary day. I remember Holmes sitting beside the window in Baker Street, sorting through correspondence and reports that had accumulated during the week. Most were of little interest. Some related to ongoing investigations, others concerned matters that would never rise beyond routine police work. Among them lay a small foreign newspaper cutting. It had been forwarded from the continent. At first glance it seemed insignificant. Yet, the moment Holmes finished reading it, a familiar expression crossed his face, the look that appeared whenever some forgotten piece of a puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Naturally, I asked what he had found. Without speaking, he handed me the clipping. The report came from Budapest. It described a strange and violent incident involving two English travelers. The details were brief. The men had been found dead after what authorities believed was a quarrel. Both had suffered fatal knife wounds. Local investigators concluded that the pair had fought one another, inflicting mortal injuries before collapsing. To the average reader, it was merely another tragic crime. To Sherlock Holmes, it was something else entirely. The names immediately attracted his attention. Earl Latimer, Wilson Kemp, the very men we had been seeking. For months they had remained beyond reach. Now, both were dead. I read the article twice, then a third time. The official explanation appeared straightforward enough. Two criminals, perhaps arguing over money, had turned upon one another. Such events were hardly uncommon, yet Holmes remained unconvinced. The report contained no proof, only assumptions. And assumptions rarely satisfied him. He leaned back in his chair and stared thoughtfully into the fire. The timing troubled him. So did the circumstances. Latimer and Kemp had survived kidnappings, investigations, international flight, and the collapse of their scheme. Why, after all that, would they suddenly destroy each other? It was possible, certainly, but Holmes suspected another explanation, a more interesting explanation, one involving a third person, a person whose name did not appear anywhere in the article. Sophocles, the surviving member of the family they had wronged, the woman who had lost her brother, the woman who had been deceived, manipulated, and carried across Europe by the very men whose bodies now lay in a foreign city. No evidence connected her to the deaths. Holmes acknowledged that freely, yet neither did he dismiss the possibility. Human beings, he often observed, are capable of extraordinary actions when grief and injustice combine. As evening settled over Baker Street, the old mystery seemed to rise once more from the shadows. The official case was closed. The criminals were dead, yet one question remained unanswered. Who, if anyone, had finally delivered justice to the men responsible for Paul Cratys's suffering? And that question would linger in Sherlock Holmes's mind for many years afterward. Years have passed since those events, yet I still find myself returning to the memory of Paul Cratys. Among the many people whose paths crossed that of Sherlock Holmes, few displayed such quiet courage. He was not a detective, not a soldier engaged in battle, not a celebrated hero whose deeds filled newspapers. He was simply a brother, a man who journeyed far from home because he feared for the safety of his sister. That simple act of loyalty carried him into the hands of ruthless men. When I reflect upon the affair, I often think of the contrast between the characters involved. On one side stood weak in body, isolated, unable to speak the language of the country in which he found himself. Yet despite every disadvantage, he remained unbroken. On the other side stood his captors. They possessed freedom, wealth, influence, and every practical advantage, yet they relied upon deception, threats, and cruelty. The comparison reveals much about human nature. True strength is not always found where one expects it. Holmes himself held great admiration for individuals who maintained their principles under pressure. He valued intelligence, certainly, but courage of character impressed him just as deeply. Paul Cratys possessed that rare quality. Even starvation failed to overcome him. The image remained vivid in my mind. The pale prisoner seated beneath the dim lamp, answering each demand with unwavering refusal. Again and again, he had been offered an easier path, one signature, one surrender, one compromise. Yet he chose hardship instead, not for personal gain, not for glory, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. Such choices are seldom easy, and they are rarely rewarded. Indeed, Paul paid the ultimate price. Yet in another sense, he achieved a victory. His captors never obtained what they wanted. Their scheme collapsed. Their plans failed. Their triumph proved temporary. As the years passed, Holmes occasionally referred to the case when discussing the unpredictable nature of criminal enterprises. The conspirators that seemed successful for a time. They controlled the house. They controlled the prisoners. They controlled the situation. Yet beneath the surface, failure had already begun. A chance encounter, a determined interpreter, a newspaper advertisement, a single moment of recognition between brother and sister. Each event appeared small. Together they destroyed everything. Looking back now, I am reminded that great events often turn upon tiny hinges. The fate of Paul Crates, Sophie Crates, Harold Latimer, and Wilson Kemp changed not because of grand plans, but because of a handful of seemingly insignificant moments. And perhaps that is one reason why the case has remained with me for so long. Another aspect of the affair that frequently occupied my thoughts was the role played by Mr. Melas, the Greek interpreter. At first glance, he appeared an unlikely hero. He was not physically imposing. He possessed no special training in danger or investigation. Indeed, during his first encounter with the conspirators, he had been thoroughly frightened, and with good reason. Most people, when threatened by armed criminals, think first of their own safety. Few dare risk provoking men who had already demonstrated their willingness to imprison and abuse another human being. Yet, Mr. Melas did exactly that. Seated beneath the dim light of that strange room, surrounded by enemies, he recognized an opportunity, a small opportunity, a dangerous opportunity, and he chose to use it. Instead of merely translating the questions placed before him, he quietly inserted questions of his own. Little by little, he extracted information from Paul Crates, his identity, his homeland, his circumstances. Each answer increased the risk. Had the conspirators understood Greek, the deception would have been discovered immediately. The consequences might have been severe. Yet Melas persisted. Not because he expected reward, not because he sought an adventure, but because he understood that another man's life depended upon it. Holmes often remarked that courage takes many forms. The public tends to admire dramatic acts, soldiers charging into battle, or explorers facing great dangers. Yet quieter forms of bravery exist as well. The courage to speak when silence would be safer, the courage to help when turning away would be easier, the courage to act despite fear. Melas displayed precisely that kind of courage. His reward was hardly enviable. He was kidnapped twice, threatened repeatedly, beaten, nearly murdered. Only the narrowest margins separated him from the fate that overtook Paul Crates, and yet, without his actions, the mystery might never have been solved at all. The authorities would never have learned of the prisoner's existence. Sherlock Holmes would never have become involved. The house at Beckenham might never have been discovered. Even the final collapse of the conspiracy may have depended upon the chain of events he set in motion. I believe Holmes understood this. Though he rarely distributed compliments freely, he always spoke of Mr. Melas with genuine respect afterward. In a world that often celebrates strength, wealth, and influence, the interpreter possessed none of those advantages. What he possessed was conscience. And, in the end, conscience proved far more valuable. As I reflected upon the case, it seemed to me that many of its most important figures shared a similar quality. Paul Crates, Sophie Crates, Melas. None were detectives, none were powerful, yet each, in different ways, demonstrated a moral courage that left a lasting impression upon everyone who heard their story. As the years passed, I came to appreciate another remarkable aspect of the affair. It was the first occasion on which I met Mycroft Holmes. Many readers have asked me over the years whether Sherlock truly considered his brother the superior reasoner. The answer is yes. He said so more than once. And on the subject of his own abilities, Sherlock Holmes was never inclined toward false modesty. Yet the relationship between the brothers fascinated me for another reason. They represented two very different expressions of the same extraordinary gift. Mycroft possessed immense intellectual power. He could examine a problem, absorb its details, and arrive at conclusions with astonishing speed. In many respects, his reasoning was even more refined than Sherlock's, yet he rarely acted. He preferred observation to investigation, theory to practice, comfort to exertion. Sherlock, by contrast, could never leave a problem alone. A mystery demanded pursuit. A clue demanded examination. A question demanded an answer. His restless nature drove him forward. The Greek interpreter case demonstrated this difference perfectly. Mycroft recognized the significance of the mystery almost immediately. He placed advertisements. He considered possibilities. He connected facts. But there his involvement largely ended. Sherlock took the next step, then another, and another. He visited witnesses, sent telegrams, consulted the police, traveled to Beckenham, forced entry into a dangerous house, and ultimately uncovered the truth. Watching the two brothers together that evening at the Diogenes Club had been a rare privilege. The resemblance between them was undeniable, not merely in appearance, but in the precision of their thinking, yet their differences were equally striking. One mind remained seated comfortably in an armchair, the other ventured into the world. Perhaps that is why Sherlock became famous, while Mycroft remained largely unknown. Reasoning alone rarely changes events. Someone must eventually rise from the chair and act. Still, Holmes always spoke of his brother with genuine respect. That respect was particularly evident during the Greek interpreter affair. Whenever Mycroft offered an opinion, Sherlock listened carefully. Whenever Mycroft reached a conclusion, Sherlock treated it seriously. Such trust was unusual. Holmes questioned nearly everyone. He questioned witnesses, police inspectors, government officials, even me, yet he seldom questioned Mycroft. The case, therefore, remains memorable, not only for its mystery, but because it offered a rare glimpse into Sherlock Holmes's private world. For one evening, the solitary detective ceased to be an isolated figure. Instead, he became a younger brother, sitting beside an elder sibling whose abilities he openly admired. And for a man as reserved as Sherlock Holmes, that revelation may have been almost as remarkable as the mystery itself. There was another reason why the case remained firmly fixed in my memory. It revealed how fragile even the most carefully constructed schemes can be. When Harold Latimer and Wilson Kemp first set their plan into motion, they must have believed success was inevitable. From their perspective, every advantage belonged to them. Paul Cretides was alone in a foreign country, spoke little or no English. They controlled his movements. They controlled his surroundings. Even his communication with the outside world had been severed. To criminals, such circumstances must have appeared ideal. Yet the flaw in their plan was not practical. It was human. They underestimated people. They underestimated Paul. They underestimated Sophie. And they certainly underestimated Mr. Mellis. Again and again, their assumptions proved wrong. They assumed starvation would break Paul's will. It did not. They assumed Sophie would remain ignorant of her brother's presence. She discovered the truth. They assumed an interpreter would simply obey instructions. Instead, he became their undoing. Holmes often pointed out that criminals frequently make this mistake. They calculate risks. They study opportunities. They prepare elaborate arrangements, yet they forget to account for qualities that cannot easily be measured: loyalty, courage, conscience, love. Such things rarely appear in criminal calculations, and yet they possess enormous power. The moment Sophie entered that room and recognized her brother, the conspiracy began collapsing. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not visibly, but the collapse had begun. The criminals could no longer rely upon secrecy. The foundation of their entire scheme had cracked. From that instant forward, every action they took became more desperate. Their threats grew harsher. Their decisions became riskier. Their escape plans accelerated. And desperate people often make mistakes. Looking back, it is remarkable how quickly events unfolded afterward. Only a short time separated that emotional reunion from the arrival of Sherlock Holmes at the Myrtles. Only a short time separated that emotional reunion from the arrival of Sherlock Holmes at the Myrtles. One moment, Latimer and Kemp believed themselves masters of the situation. The next, they were fugitives fleeing across Europe. Such reversals fascinated Holmes. He viewed them as evidence of a larger principle. Truth, he often said, possesses stubborn quality. It can be concealed, delayed, distorted, but rarely destroyed. Sooner or later, it tends to emerge. The Greek interpreter affair provided a perfect example. Despite lies, imprisonment, threats, disguises, and violence, the truth eventually surfaced, not completely, not perfectly, but sufficiently. Enough to expose the guilty, enough to reveal the innocent, enough to ensure that the story would not vanish into darkness. And perhaps that, in the end, was the greatest defeat suffered by the conspirators. Their crimes were discovered, their victims were remembered, and their names became forever linked to failure rather than triumph. Whenever I think back upon the affair, one image returns more vividly than any other. It is not the gloomy house at Beckenham, nor the sinister figure of Wilson Kemp, nor even the terrible room filled with charcoal fumes. Instead, I remember the brief reunion between Paul and Sophie Cratides. The entire mystery seemed to revolve around that single moment. For weeks, perhaps longer, brother and sister had been separated by deception. Each believed the other far away, each worried without understanding the full extent of the danger. And then, by pure chance, they found themselves face to face, only for a few seconds. Yet those few seconds changed everything. As a physician, I had often observed the extraordinary strength produced by human affection. People endure hardships that reason alone cannot explain. They survive suffering that appears impossible. The bond between the Cratides siblings seemed to possess precisely that quality. Paul had crossed Europe for Sophie's sake. He had endured imprisonment for Sophie's sake. He had faced starvation rather than abandon his responsibilities toward her. And when she appeared before him unexpectedly, his first reaction was not fear, anger, or despair. It was recognition, relief, joy. Even after everything he had suffered, the scene moved Mr. Mellors deeply when he described it. It moved me as well, and I suspect it affected Sherlock Holmes more than he admitted. Although Holmes often cultivated an image of cold logic, people frequently misunderstood him. He was not devoid of feeling, far from it. He simply concealed his emotions beneath discipline and intellect. Cases involving loyalty and sacrifice always commanded his respect. The Greek interpreter affair contained both in abundance. Indeed, one could argue that loyalty stood at the heart of the entire story. Paul's loyalty to Sophie, Sophie's loyalty to her brother, Mr. Mellis's loyalty to his conscience. Even Sherlock's determination to pursue the matter reflected a kind of loyalty to justice itself. Against these forces stood greed, and greed, however powerful it may appear for a time, rarely possesses the same endurance. Lautimer and Kemp pursued wealth. The others pursued something far more meaningful. Perhaps that is why the victims remain memorable, while the villains fade into the background. Many years have passed since those events, yet I can still picture that dimly lighted room. The sudden cry of recognition, the removal of the plaster, the desperate embrace. For a brief instant, truth overcame deception, family overcame isolation, and hope overcame fear. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it altered the course of every life involved, and without it, the mystery of the Greek interpreter might never have been solved at all. As I write these recollections, I find myself reflecting upon the curious role that chance played throughout the affair. Sherlock Holmes often argued that what people call luck is frequently the result of unnoticed causes, yet even he admitted that chance occasionally intervenes in human affairs with remarkable force. The Greek interpreter case offers several striking examples. Consider Mr. Mellis. Out of all the interpreters in London, why was he chosen? The answer, of course, was practical. He happened to be available and well known among the Greek-speaking community. Yet that simple choice altered everything. Had another interpreter been selected, one less curious, less courageous, or less observant, the entire mystery might have remained hidden forever. Then there was the meeting between Paul and Sophie. The conspirators had taken extraordinary precautions to keep them apart. Weeks of planning had gone into maintaining that separation. Yet one unexpected visit, one impulsive decision by a lonely young woman, destroyed those precautions. In an instant, chance opened the door, truth stepped through it, and the conspiracy never recovered. Even our own involvement began through coincidence. Mycroft Holmes not happened to know Mr. Mellis, the interpreter, might never have shared his story. Had Sherlock and I not visited the Diogenes Club that evening, the matter might have remained little more than an unanswered curiosity. The chain of events was astonishing when viewed in retrospect. One small occurrence leading to another, one seemingly insignificant decision, creating consequences far beyond what anyone could foresee. Holmes frequently reminded me that investigations often resemble great webs. Touch one thread, and vibrations travel throughout the entire structure. The Greek interpreter affair demonstrated this principle beautifully. Every participant influenced the outcome: the criminals, the victims, the interpreter, the police. Even individuals who appeared only briefly played their part. The porter who directed Mr. Mellis after his release, the newspaper readers who noticed Mycroft's advertisement, the correspondent who later forwarded the clipping from Budapest. Without any one of them, the final picture might have remained incomplete. Perhaps that is why the story continues to fascinate me. It reminds us that lives intersect in unexpected ways. A stranger encountered for a moment may influence events months later. A single choice may ripple outward beyond all prediction. And sometimes when enough of those threads converge, an entire mystery is revealed. As the years passed, I came to view the affair not merely as a detective story, but as a study of how fate, character, and circumstance combine to shape human lives. And nowhere was that combination more evident than in the extraordinary sequence of events that brought the hidden tragedy of the Cratides family into the light. Of all the individuals involved in the case, perhaps none remains more mysterious than Sophie Cratides. The fate of her brother eventually became known. The fate of her persecutors became known. But Sophie herself seemed to drift into the shadows of history, leaving behind more questions than answers. After the events at the Myrtles, she vanished alongside Harold Latimer and Wilson Kemp. Whether she accompanied them willingly or under compulsion was never fully established. Sherlock Holmes leaned strongly toward the latter explanation. Everything he had learned suggested that she had been deceived from the beginning. The affection she may once have felt for Latimer could hardly have survived the discovery of her brother's imprisonment. No reasonable person could witness such cruelty and remain blind to the character of those responsible. Yet circumstances have a way of trapping people, particularly in foreign countries. Particularly when friends, family, and support systems are far away. It is possible that Sophie found herself with few choices. The conspirators were desperate men. Desperate men are unpredictable. Holmes occasionally speculated about the period following their escape from England. He imagined long journeys across the continent, frequent changes of location, constant anxiety. A life spent looking over one's shoulder. Such a life would place enormous strain upon any group, especially one already divided by mistrust. If Sophie remained with them during that time, she would have carried knowledge that made her uniquely dangerous. She knew their crimes. She knew their identities. She knew what had happened to her brother. No criminal could feel entirely comfortable in the presence of such a witness, and no victim could easily forget such injuries. These tensions must have grown with every passing week. Fear, resentment, suspicion, grief, all traveling together, all confined within the same uncertain future. The more Holmes considered the matter, the less he believed that such an arrangement could last indefinitely. Something had to give. Something eventually did. When news arrived from Budapest concerning the deaths of Latimer and Kemp, Holmes immediately connected it to these underlying tensions, not because he possessed evidence. He did not. Because the outcome seemed consistent with everything he understood about human behavior. Crime founded upon greed had ended in violence. Such endings are rarely accidental. Whether Sophie played any direct role remained unknown. The truth may never be discovered, yet one fact appears certain. The young woman who entered that dim room at the Myrtles was not the same woman who later vanished across Europe. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. And whatever path Sophie Cratides followed afterward, it was undoubtedly shaped by the terrible events that had claimed her brother and destroyed the lives of everyone around her. As time went on, the case gradually settled into that peculiar category copied by many of Sherlock Holmes's investigations, solved in its essentials, yet forever retaining a few unanswered questions. Holmes himself was surprisingly comfortable with such uncertainties. Contrary to popular belief, he did not require every mystery to conclude perfectly. What mattered most to him was understanding the truth. Absolute completeness, while desirable, was not always possible. The Greek interpreter affair illustrated this reality better than most. We learned who the criminals were. We learned what they wanted. We learned how they carried out their scheme. We even learned the likely fate that eventually overtook them. Yet certain details vanished forever alongside the people who knew them. Where exactly had Latimer first met Sophie? What promises had he made? How had Wilson Kemp become involved? What conversations passed between the conspirators during their flight across Europe? Those answers disappeared into silence, and perhaps they always will. For me, however, the most memorable aspect of the affair was not the mystery itself. It was the atmosphere surrounding it. Even now, I can recall the strange mood of that summer evening when it began. The quiet rooms of the Diogenes Club, the soft glow of the lamps, the contrast between Sherlock and Mycroft Holmes seated beside one another, and the arrival of Mr. Mellis and his extraordinary tale. At first it had seemed merely curious, an unusual story, a strange adventure, yet with every passing minute the darkness beneath the surface became more apparent. A hidden prisoner, a desperate family, a conspiracy fueled by greed. What began as an intriguing puzzle slowly transformed into a race against time. Many Holmes cases unfolded in a similar manner, the ordinary revealing the extraordinary, the mundane concealing the dangerous. But few did so with such elegance. The clues were present from the beginning: the mysterious carriage, the covered windows, the concealed identity of the prisoner. Each detail pointed toward the truth long before the truth became visible. That quality always pleased Holmes. He admired mysteries whose solutions emerged naturally from the evidence. No tricks, no impossible coincidences, only careful observation and logical reasoning. The Greek interpreter case possessed those qualities in abundance. Perhaps that is why he occasionally referred to it years afterward. Not frequently. Holmes rarely indulged in nostalgia. But now and then, some small detail, a newspaper report, a mention of Greece, or a discussion involving Mycroft, would bring the memory briefly back to life. And whenever it did, I noticed the same thoughtful expression upon his face. Not satisfaction, not regret, something quieter. The expression of a man remembering lives forever, altered by a handful of extraordinary days. And among those lives, none seemed to linger more persistently than that the brave and unfortunate Paul Cratides. When readers ask me which lesson can be drawn from the affair of the Greek interpreter, I find the question surprisingly difficult to answer. Most detective stories seem to offer an obvious moral. Crime fails, justice prevails, truth triumphs. Yet real life is rarely so tidy. The events surrounding Paul and Sophie Cratides remind us that victory and loss often exist side by side. Justice, after all, arrived imperfectly. All Cratides died. Nothing could change that fact. No arrest, no verdict, no newspaper headline could restore the life that had been taken from him. His courage was rewarded not with safety, but with sacrifice, and yet his resistance was not meaningless. Had he yielded, the conspirators would likely have obtained everything they desired. Their crimes would have succeeded. His suffering would have served their ambitions. Instead, he denied them at victory. Even in defeat, he preserved something important: his integrity, his principles, his loyalty to his sister. Holmes often maintained that character reveals itself most clearly during adversity. Comfort allows people to appear virtuous. Hardship reveals whether they truly are. By that standard, Paul Cratides proved himself a remarkable man. The same may be said of Mr. Mellis. He had every reason to remain silent. The criminals frightened him. The danger was obvious, yet he chose involvement over safety. Without that decision, the entire affair might have vanished into obscurity. The victims would have disappeared. The criminals would have prospered. No one would ever have known. Instead, one ordinary man decided that conscience mattered more than convenience. Such decisions rarely receive public recognition, yet they shape the world in quiet ways. Sherlock Holmes appreciated this deeply. Despite his reputation as a champion of logic, he understood that human character often matters as much as intellect. A brilliant villain remains a villain. A frightened but decent man may accomplish extraordinary things. The Greek interpreter affair contained examples of both. As I reflect upon the story now, years after its conclusion, I find that the mystery itself occupies less of my attention than the people involved, the courageous interpreter, the grieving sister, even the strange and unsettling Wilson Kemp, whose nervous laughter concealed so much malice. Together they formed a drama far richer than any simple puzzle. And perhaps that explains why the case has remained vivid in my memory, long after many more sensational adventures have faded, for beneath its mystery lay something timeless, a story of loyalty tested by greed. As I near the end of this account, my thoughts return once more to Baker Street. The mystery had begun there, not with a crime scene or a desperate client, but with a simple conversation on a quiet summer evening. Had Sherlock Holmes not mentioned his brother that day, the entire affair might have passed beyond our notice. It is curious how often the great turning points of life arrive, disguised as ordinary moments, a casual remark, a chance meeting, a knock at a door. The Greek interpreter case emerged from such humble beginnings, yet it carried us through hidden houses, secret imprisonments, desperate escapes, and tragedies that stretched across Europe. The farther I travel from those events in memory, the more I appreciate their peculiar interconnectedness. Every person involved altered the outcome. Mycroft Holmes, whose advertisement brought forth crucial information; Mr. Malus, whose courage exposed the conspiracy; Inspector Gregson, whose assistance allowed us to reach the Myrtles. Even the anonymous individuals who passed messages and letters from one hand to another played their part. No one solved the mystery alone. Holmes himself would have been the first to acknowledge this. Though the public often imagines great detectives working in isolation, the truth is more complicated. Information comes from countless sources. Success depends upon cooperation as much as brilliance. The Greek interpreter affair demonstrated that truth repeatedly. Yet among all the figures connected to the story, one stands apart: Paul Crates. He never sat in Baker Street, never met Sherlock Holmes, never learned how many people eventually tried to help him. And yet his influence reached every stage of the investigation. His determination inspired Mr. Malus. His disappearance launched the search. His resistance ultimately destroyed the plans of his captors. In many ways, he remained the central figure from beginning to end. I sometimes wonder what he might have thought had he known the full story. Would he have considered his sacrifice worthwhile? Would he have taken comfort from the eventual collapse of the conspiracy? Those questions can never be answered, but I like to believe that he would have found some peace in knowing that the truth emerged at last, not perfectly, not completely, yet sufficiently, enough that his story would not be forgotten, enough that those who wronged him did not enjoy the rewards they sought, enough that his loyalty to his sister would be remembered long after their names had faded from public memory. But perhaps, in the end, that is all any of us can reasonably hope for. Thus concludes the singular affair of the Greek interpreter. Of all the cases that passed through the hands of Sherlock Holmes, few combined so many unusual elements: a hidden prisoner, an unknown house, a secret carried across nations, and a mystery whose final chapter unfolded far from England itself. Yet what remains with me most strongly is not the crime, it is the humanity. The story began with concealment, a brother searching for a sister deceived by those she trusted, a stranger drawn unwillingly into dangerous affairs. Around them moved men driven by greed, believing that money justified cruelty and that power guaranteed success. For a time it seemed they might be right. The prisoners were helpless. Conspirators controlled every circumstance. Escape appeared impossible. And yet, as so often happens, they fail to account for the qualities that cannot easily be measured: courage, loyalty, conscience, love. Those invisible forces altered everything. Paul Cratides refused to surrender. Melis refused to remain passive. Sophie refused to forget her brother. And Sherlock Holmes refused to ignore mystery simply because it appeared difficult. Together, their actions set in motion the chain of events that ultimately destroyed the conspiracy. Not all endings are happy. This one certainly was not. A brave man lost his life. Questions remained unanswered. The final details vanished into history. Yet there was justice of a kind. The guilty did not prosper. Their scheme failed. Their victims were remembered. And the truth, though delayed, emerged into the light. Even now, when I recall that summer evening in Baker Street, I can almost see Holmes seated opposite me, calmly mentioning for the first time that he possessed an older brother. Neither of us knew where that conversation would lead. Neither of us could have imagined the strange tale waiting beyond the doors of the Diogenes Club. Such are the unpredictable pathways of life. A simple remark becomes an adventure becomes a mystery, and a mystery becomes a story carried through the years. For my own part, I have recorded it here as faithfully as memory allows, in the hope that the names of Paul and Sophie Cratides, of Mr. Melis, and even of the formidable Mycroft Holmes may continue to be remembered. And so, with the lamps of Baker Street burning softly in memory, and London's distant sounds fading into the night, I bring this recollection to its close. The case of the Greek interpreter was ended, but its echoes remained with us for many years thereafter.